Welcome back to Proxammer, everybody, and today we're going to be wrapping up our tier lists with our HQ slot. And, we have a lot of choices here. We have all of our Phoenix Lords to cover today, as well as the twin avatars. I am going to be covering the Ynnari characters as well. However, I won't be covering the Phoenix Lord of the Shadow Spectres today, as I'm going to be doing him in a later video. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So a quick overview of the video today. We're going to be doing an analysis of where our HQ units are in the current meta, accounting for the release of new codexes and balanced data slates in Nephilim. And as always, just a disclaimer, these are just my opinions based on my own experience and analysis of the rules and matchups in the current state of the game, and are by no means definitive. You guys may have different opinions on a few of the units, and if you do, please leave a comment in the comment section. I'd love to hear why you guys think certain units belong in certain tiers. So please do leave a comment. I'd love to have a discussion about it. So we're going to be looking at 18 different units spanning from all across our HQ section. And units in S tier are going to be considered top of the line and best in slot for most competitive builds. A tier units are great units that are effective in the role. B tier units are solid units but have some minor issues. C tier units are weaker units that have some more serious issues. And lastly, D tier units are a really weak unit that needs a lot of help and investment. So first up, we have the Avatar of Khaine. So the Avatar of Khaine, I think, is an A tier unit, being extremely durable, halving all damage, having a 4+ invulnerable save, and also access to Fortune, which makes him incredibly tough. Now, one thing that I've heard a few people think is that the Avatar has access to Craftworld traits. The Avatar does not actually get access to Craftworld traits or attributes. So you can't give him a 5+ ignores mortal wounds if you're with Uthway, and you can't give him, a 3-inch minimum battle focus with the Biel-Tan, unfortunately, right? So he doesn't have that, but he does have access to Fortune, which gives him a massive durability boost. He's a massive combat threat with a variable attack that can kill infantry or tanks or anything in between, really. And he can be granted objective secured with the Will of Asurmen ability. So he's actually one of the few units in our codex that can actually stand on an objective and actually be pretty durable on it, and not for nothing, but any unit that gets into combat with him and tries to take that objective from him is going to be in a world of hurt because he can actually hit back very hard. However, the reason why I don't think he's quite S tier is because he requires a whole lot of support. And it definitely can be done, and it can be a serious threat on the battlefield, but it requires a lot of support and is a big target. Again, certain armies are going to be able to find him on the objective and actually be able to kill him, either with weapons that ignore invul saves or weapons that auto wound and things like that. He's exceptionally vulnerable to, especially if your opponent has a whole lot of them. So beware about that. But yeah, the Avatar is very durable and can definitely be used to hold an objective in the midfield, and can be used to threaten your opponent's army because he is a very big combat threat. So really good unit. Love the Avatar of Khaine. He does require quite a bit of support, though, to be effective. And of course, next up is Baharoth. So Baharoth is interesting because he is a very fast Phoenix Lord and very durable, as he does have a 4+ invul save and can only take 3 wounds per phase, which is really good for Baharoth because he's really only probably going to be taking damage from shooting. And the cool thing about Baharoth is he can reposition very easily with the Cloud Strider ability, which can be used after shooting or combat. And this makes him very difficult to deal with. So whether he wants to charge into something, attack it, and then Cloud Strike out behind obscuring terrain so your opponent can't retaliate, or whether he wants to shoot something off an objective and then Cloud Strike onto another objective, or maybe even that same objective to capture it, the possibilities are really endless with this guy. And he's pretty much a staple in a lot of tournament lists because he's so versatile and you can do a lot of different things on the battlefield. He has objectives secured, he can eliminate targets, capture objectives, and pretty much go wherever he is needed to support your army. So Baharoth is definitely an S tier unit, even though personally I don't really run him in a lot of lists. I kind of find him a little bit of a boring piece in my mind, and that's just my personal opinion. But despite my personal opinion, I think he is a fantastic model with fantastic rules that really play to the strengths of the Eldar. So he definitely belongs in S tier. And on to Fuegan. So Fuegan is one of those Phoenix Lords that I put in C tier. Now, I did make a video in the past with Fuegan in it, and I said that Fuegan is good for this specific strategy. But I have to say, in general, Fuegan is not a good Phoenix Lord. He does get extra strength and toughness over the average Phoenix Lord as far as stats go, but these don't really come into play that often, and he has mediocre damage both at ranged and in combat with no mortal wound potential at all. And his shooting attack isn't the greatest, right? I mean, he's basically doing the same thing a Fire Dragon Exarch could do, and to be honest with you, he's paying a lot more points for it. However, he is, again, like I said before, part of an absolutely fantastic and funny combination with Dire Avengers. I also have a video on this called The Flaming Shuriken. Check it out. It's on my channel. It's pretty funny. Basically, you take Fuegan and you use a squad of 10 Dire Avengers to do insane amounts of damage with the Avengers of Asurien stratagem. So check it out if you want to do something a little bit different and run Fuegan in one of your lists and actually make him work. Check it out. But otherwise, in any other capacity, Fuegan is just not good. And I definitely think he is on the lower tiers of this tier list. However, Asurmen, on the other hand, is quite a bit better. Now, I actually put him in B tier, but not for the reasons you might think, because I actually think he has great shooting and melee damage with a lot of high damage mortal wound potential in combat. He is an absolute monster in close combat. He can kill Terminators left and right. He has great synergy with Dire Avengers because they really do well with objective secured, and the +2 leadership helps out a bit too. And he has a 3+ invul, so he's extra durable against high AP attacks. However, the reason I gave him B tier is because Asurmen has to be run in a transport. He's pretty slow, pretty much needs to be put in a transport, and his weapons don't quite have the range to make him a good foot piece. So I know you might see 24-inch range on there and say, oh, Asurmen, he's probably pretty good for, mid-range engagements where he can walk up on the battlefield. But the truth is that Asurmen has no real good way of getting out of trouble. So even though he has a 3+ invul save, his battle focus is only D6. And he really doesn't have a great way of getting out of trouble. So he can get in kind of sticky situations if you're not careful with them. And of course, you need to run him with support. So Wave Serpents, Dire Avengers, things like that to make the most out of him. So that's why I put him in B tier. I don't think he's bad at all. I think he's a solid choice, but he is kind of slow and definitely needs to be put in some sort of transport. And next we have Maugan Ra. So Maugan Ra, I ended up putting in C tier with Fuegan. Now, I don't think he's as bad as Fuegan at all. However, Maugan Ra also has a lot of issues. He has really weak melee damage when compared to the other Phoenix Lords. His range damage is good, but it's nothing to write home about for its cost. And, he has a lot of line of sight issues when used in the backline. So he can definitely be used to pick off enemies on a middle objective or something like that. But the thing is a lot of our army isn't wanting for units that can pick off enemies on the middle or no man's land objectives. We don't really need a unit like this, so he doesn't really fulfill a role that other units in our army couldn't already fulfill just by being there, right? And also, his objective secured can be useful in the backline, but he just really doesn't hit that hard again for his points, and for the most part, he can kind of be ignored. I do, however, like the idea of sticking him next to something like a webway gate, if you do take a webway gate in your army, so that he can basically score on hidden path every turn. I think that's a great kind of way to use him if you do really want to run Maugan Ra and you're not so worried about, terrain and stuff like that blocking your webway gate, then I think that's a great way to run him. And he can be very good in a list like that. Supported by some rangers in the backfield so that he doesn't get picked off. Because, he is a character, he still has lookouts and things like that. So you do want to make sure that he is also within range of other units. But I think that's a pretty good way to run him. But other than that, I just don't really see him being used in that many lists. And his damage is fairly mediocre at best. As for Karandras, on the other hand, I think Karandras is a fantastic Phoenix Lord, and I ended up putting him in A tier. Now, why did I put him in A tier and Asurmen in B tier? Well, the main reason is because Karandras has advanced positions to easily get first turn charges on enemy units. So this is absolutely devastating for your opponent. If you are able to line up Karandras into something like an enemy HQ unit or a high priority target, Karandras can wipe them out completely, and then he is small enough to be able to hide behind obscuring terrain and make it very hard for your opponent to actually retaliate. And on top of that, if you have other units that are also being used in a supporting and aggressive way, Karandras can get away with absolute murder in that game. Especially if you're running him with things like striking scorpions to get an alpha strike on enemy units, he can be extremely effective and deadly in that role. And again, he has great combat potential to back it up and can deal with heavier or lighter infantry, either with Aura's Bane or Ismathil. Either weapon is extremely effective at eliminating enemy infantry. And something else you might have missed, but Karandras' Mandablasters actually are able to target monstrous creatures as well as infantry. So still can't target vehicles, but can target monstrous creatures. So that gives him an additional layer of threat against different enemy units. And moving on to Jain Zar, Karandras' contemporary. Basically, Jain Zar is, in my opinion, a B tier unit. Now, why is Jain Zar a B tier unit? Well, she is extremely fast and has very high damage potential against heavy and lighter infantry. She forces enemies to strike last while within her engagement range and at -1 attack. So why is Jain Zar in B tier with Asurmen? Well, I think Jain Zar really needs a transport just like Asurmen to be the most effective. And again, this is additional investment that other Phoenix Lords do not need to worry about. Baharoth and Karandras don't need to worry about having to invest in a transport, whereas Jain Zar very much does. And if you're running her with Howling Banshees, she can be very effective in combat, but that means you have to use your Howling Banshees very aggressively. And Jain Zar, in those kind of forward situations, she's tough, but she's not super tough. So she can get caught out and she can get killed. And if your opponent has answers to Howling Banshees and Jain Zar after they get out and do their damage, then unfortunately, you're not going to make your points up with her. So you do need to be careful with her. She is a little bit of a tricky piece to use. But I can't lie, Jain Zar is pretty powerful in combat. Now, I don't quite think she's as good as a unit of Howling Banshees, but to be honest, neither are most Phoenix Lords when compared with their own aspects, except maybe Baharoth and maybe Karandras. But I still do think she's pretty solid. I just think she has that one weakness of having to A, take a transport, and B, basically in most games having to be used in an aggressive way to be able to make up her points cost. And next up, we have the infamous Farseer. So the Farseer is an S tier unit. No surprises there. Farseers can give a multiple of buffs, debuffs, and utility powers to help our units operate at peak efficiency, which is a core aspect to running Craftworld Eldar. And on top of that, the Farseer is very reliable. Doesn't suffer perils and allows a Warlock unit to be taken without using up a detachment slot, and also allows for Strands of Fate rerolls, which is extremely useful for getting the right Strands of Fate on the turn that you plan to do your charges out of Deep Strike, for the turn that you plan on using certain psychic powers to make sure they go off. Again, having the right Strands of Fate dice in a game is crucial to the success of how we play on the battlefield. So having at least a couple Farseers in your list is usually required to get the most out of your army. And the Farseer Skyrunner is very much an S tier unit as well. It has the added benefit for a couple of extra points, well, not a couple, about 20 extra points, to be extremely fast and be able to get to wherever he is needed. So the other cool thing about the Farseer is it actually comes with a twin-link shuriken catapult if you put it on a jet bike. And to be honest with you, I've had several instances in the late game where those shuriken catapults really come in clutch for me. And also just being able to move 16 inches and then advance an automatic 6 inches with the Ride the Wind is a great way to contest and capture objectives in the late game that your opponent might not expect your Farseer to do. So definitely a great unit. I would say that the Farseer Skyrunner is a little bit better than the Farseer on foot, even with the increased cost, because of the added versatility that the Skyrunner gets with that high movement and with that a little bit of extra damage. And then we come to the Autarchs Skyrunner. So the Autarchs Skyrunner has decent damage with the laser lance, very solid. Has a good aura that allows rerolls of 1 to hit when within 6 inches of him. He allows an extra command reroll per turn, and he is extremely fast. But here's the thing. The Autarch Skyrunner lacks options. So the Autarch Skyrunner unfortunately lacks the Banshee Masks, the Manda Blasters, and things like that. I think that if the Autarch Skyrunner was able to use those war gear options, he would definitely be an A tier unit. However, I did put him in B tier because he just doesn't have the same amount of options as other units in your army. And if you charge him into something and you charge one of your other units into something in the same turn, he can be liable to get counter assaulted. So basically, or I should say counter offensive, which basically allows an enemy unit to strike before your next unit in combat. So unfortunately, because he doesn't have the Banshee Mask, he is liable to getting killed in this way, which is not good. You don't want your Autarch to die like that. So I did put him in B tier. I think Autarchs in general are a little bit underpowered to where they should be. I think Farseers are so much more of an attractive option to a lot of Eldar builds. So while I don't think Autarchs are terrible at all, I think they're pretty solid units. I do think they get overshadowed by some other things like Farseers and stuff like that. So I ended up putting the Autarch Skyrunner in B tier, not only for being overshadowed by Farseers, but also because he can't really take the best options like the Banshee Mask and the Manda Blasters. And the regular Autarch I also put in B tier. Now the thing about the regular Autarch is, again, great aura, rerolls of 1 to hit within 6 inches is pretty good. Allows an extra command reroll per turn, which is decent. Sometimes you need that. Has plentiful war gear options and weapon options to support various parts of your army. So I think this is a really awesome aspect of the Autarch that I recently learned, that thankfully the Autarch can take pretty much any option on the list without having to worry, because, you know, people have different model kits and stuff like that. I guess GW fixed that a couple months ago. I was never aware of it, so I still was running my Autarch in a different way in the builds that I did have an Autarch in. But the Autarch's a bit on the fragile side, to be honest, and it's not that fast. If you do give it the Warp Jump Generator or the Swooping Hawk Wings with all the fixings, and you give him a fusion gun and all that, he tends to get rather expensive. And for me, that's where you kind of lose me, is when I'm spending over 100 points on an Autarch when I could spend much less than that on a regular Farseer and get much more mileage out of a Farseer. That's kind of when you lose me as far as an Autarch goes. Now, I do like the Autarch Skyrunner. Again, there's a lot of things you can do with an Autarch Skyrunner. You can give him the Sunstorm Relic and things like that, and you can be very quick with that and also have objective secured. The Autarch on foot is really limited with the amount of relics he can take, and he's rather expensive. So he basically becomes the same cost as a Autarch Skyrunner, even though he has more options like Banshee Mask and things like that. Well, the trade-off is that he's a bit more fragile, and a regular Farseer is just going to be a little bit more value. So I do like the Autarch. Again, I do think it's a solid unit. Probably a bit too expensive. I think, you know, they increased the cost when they nerfed the Eldar Codex a while back in Nephilim. I don't think that the Autarch actually needed a points increase, but to be honest with you, just a little bit too expensive. I think if you drop the cost on it and maybe made the options a little bit cheaper, I think he would be a much more attractive piece in a lot of builds. And of course, next up is the Spiritseer. So the Spiritseer, the thing about the Spiritseer is that it's really only viable when you have 2 or more Wraith units, and even then, an Autarch or a Farseer is probably just the better pick in most cases. Now, I will say this, the Spiritseer does give Wraith units a reroll of 1. It can cast only 1 power a turn, though, which is kind of its downside. It can cast 1 Runes of Battle or Fortune ability, which is kind of a big letdown. Again, Runes of Battle are pretty easy to get from Warlocks, and Runes of Fortune can be cast better from Farseers because they don't suffer perils of warp and things like that. And even though the Spiritseer does allow for some stratagem synergy for healing Wraith units, in general, unless you have several Wraith units in your army and you're running a Wraith-centric build, a Spiritseer just isn't the right call. I think in most cases, even with a single squad of Wraith Blades, an Autarch with the Banshee Mask is going to give you much more value than a Spiritseer would, being within 6 inches of those Wraith units. So I definitely put this in C tier just because it's just not really that great. And for only being able to cast 1 power and it really doesn't have a great aura ability, it's really expensive at 75 points. So, and fragile as well. So I ended up putting it in C tier. Not the greatest unit. Can be used in Wraith builds, but unfortunately, just in some cases, even an Autarch is going to be arguably better in a Wraith build than a Spiritseer would be. And next up is Eldrad Ulthran. So Eldrad is an S-tier Farseer. He is Uthway specific though, but he has the added benefit of increased durability and can reroll all psychic tests, whether it's passed or not. So what do you mean by this, Proxy Hammer? Well, I mean, let's say that you're rolling a psychic action and your opponent has the ability to deny it, and you only need something like a 3 or a 4 on that psychic action. So I roll my psychic action or psychic test and I get a 4 and I pass the psychic action, but that's not really that great because your opponent has a really good chance of just denying that. Well, the great thing about Eldrad is you can choose to re-roll it because you don't have a great chance of failing. So you can re-roll that psychic test, maybe get something a little higher and make it harder for your opponent to actually deny that psychic ability. And also just being able to re-roll psychic tests is always good. But that's not all. Eldrad can also cast 3 powers a turn, making him a great Focus Will target. So if you have another Farseer in the list, can cast Focus Will on Eldrad, and then he's getting +3 to all of his psychic powers and actions. That is absolutely amazing. And Eldrad is a really good Farseer, even if you have to pay the extra points for him. I think he's about 40 or maybe 50 more points. Yeah, I think he's 50 more points than a regular Farseer, but in a lot of cases, he's well worth the cost. Eldrad is a very powerful Farseer and can do a lot for you in the backline. However, Prince Yriel is just about the opposite of Eldrad. So he's Iyanden specific, which is already not great because Iyanden isn't a great Craftworld, to be honest with you, as far as their benefits and buffs. He has a slightly higher damage profile than a regular Autarch with a Starglaive. He allows Corsairs to benefit from his rerolls of 1s, which is really cool. I ran a Corsair-themed list with this guy, and I actually wasn't disappointed with him. And he allows you to half the power level of units going into Strategic Reserve, saving you command points. But here's the thing. Unless you're running a very specific Corsair or Reserve-themed list within the Iyanden Craftworld, he's just not a great pick. Even in Iyanden lists that focus more on Wraiths, he's just not good. He's not going to give the benefits to the Wraith units, and he's just, honestly, in a lot of ways, a lot worse than a regular Autarch. Because again, he does not have the mobility options that a regular Autarch has with the Swooping Hawk Wings and the Warp Gem Generator, and he also doesn't have the Fusion Gun and things like this. So that's why I ended up putting him in C tier. I think Prince Yriel has a lot of issues, identity issues. He kind of wants to be a Corsair, leader of Corsairs. And to be honest with you, Corsairs don't really fit that well into Iyanden, to be quite clear, Just because most of the Iyanden specific stuff focuses more on Wraiths. I suppose you could have a mixed Wraith and Corsair list and make that work somehow, but again, that's only one specific type of build, and in any other regular build, Prince Yriel just doesn't really fit in neatly, so I ended up putting him in C tier for those reasons. But hey, on the bright side, at least Prince Yriel doesn't kill himself anymore and deal wounds to himself with the Spear of Twilight, am I right? Anyway, yeah, in case you guys didn't know, for a long time, Prince Yriel would deal mortal wounds to himself or, have some sort of ability that would kill himself if he rolled 1s to hit. So thank goodness that's gone now. And next up, we have Illic Nightspear, which is an Autarch-specific character. He's a great range character with great sniping ability, especially with Strands of Fate. He can really pick out targets to assassinate fairly easily if he can draw a line of sight. And he cannot be targeted by range attacks outside of 12 inches while receiving the benefits of cover. So I know what you guys are thinking, well, what about weapons that ignore cover? Well, luckily, he is also immune to being targeted with those weapons. And here's why. Because that special rule prevents him from being targeted in the first place, so those ignore cover's weapons would not be able to actually target him to actually activate their ignores cover effect. So in that way, even ignores cover weapons are going to be useless against Illic Nightspear outside of 12 inches. Which is really awesome because this basically means he can hide in the backfield in plain sight, have a great line of sight over all enemy units, and not really have to worry too much about getting popped unless they're within 12 inches. Now, the weakness to this is that if your enemy has something that can get within 12 inches, like a deep strike or something, you do have to watch out for that. But other than that, he's not going to be able to be popped by long-range mortars or last cannons or anything of that sort. And otherwise, unless their opponent ignores cover and they're within 12 inches, he's pretty durable in terrain, and he has battle focus, so he can shoot and move behind obscuring terrain if needed. So I'd put this guy in A tier. He's a pretty good, solid choice for any Autarch list, even though Autarch is a little bit struggling right now because a lot of factions just straight up ignore cover now. But in most situations, Illic Nightspear is going to pay really big dividends to anything he can draw line of sight to. And next up, we have the Ynnari special characters, and we're starting out with the Visarch. So the Visarch has excellent combat ability, has an ability to ignore invuls in combat, which is very strong. He can regain wounds if friendly models around him die, and if a character dies, he can gain an attack. On a 4+, that is. He has rerolls of 1s within 6 inches, just like regular Autarchs, and he's Yvraine's bodyguard and, of course, boyfriend. No, Yvraine is probably not involved with Guilliman at all. That's just a weird, creepy meme that people have in the Warhammer 40k community. Not exactly sure why. But if anybody can point me to the reasons why, I'd appreciate it in the comments. I still don't understand why people have that in their mind. Anyway, the Visarch I ended up putting in B tier because he's a pretty solid choice. I think he's around the same level as an Autarch in, you know, the amount of damage he does is obviously far greater in combat. But the thing about him is he's still pretty slow. Again, he doesn't have any psychic abilities, so he can't really help out in that department. And the other thing about him is that in a lot of different ways, when you're limited in the amount of HQs you can have in a Ynnari list, most of the time you're probably just going to want to go with a regular Farseer with the Runes of Fortune for things like Ghost Walk and Focus Will and things like that. I don't think the Visarch is bad at all. I just think in most cases he's not needed. He's like an extra, right? He's cool to have. You can definitely run him. You can run the Triumvirate and all that stuff, and he can be very effective. But is he without his issues? Probably not. Again, he's pretty slow. He doesn't have access to things that make him faster, like Swooping Hawkwings or a Warp Jump Generator, so he's going to need a transport. And if you're putting him in a Falcon, you're not going to have room for Yvraine or other characters that might also want to accompany your unit of Howling Banshees or whatever else you have in there. So he's a little bit in a tricky spot, and to be honest, he doesn't quite fit into a lot of, you know, Ynnari builds, so I ended up putting him in B tier, although I do think he's very powerful in his own right. He has very good combat ability, but again, in a lot of Ynnari lists, he just seems kind of redundant. And next up we have Yvraine, and she is a great character. She has good combat ability for a Psyker and can deal a good amount of mortal wounds. And as friendly Psykers die around her, she learns more powers and can regain wounds for friendly models killed within 6, which is very helpful for keeping her alive in those kind of long, drawn-out situations where she's going to be taking wounds over the course of the game. And just like Eldrad, she can reroll all of her Psyche tests and has increased durability. However, I think her downside, and probably why she's not an S tier unit, is because she only knows powers from the Revenant discipline and can only cast 2 a turn. So I think this is really a letdown because she can't learn Runes of Fortune abilities, which kind of limits her in a lot of ways. And when compared with something like the Yncarne, who knows all of the psychic powers, if you're taking the Yncarne and you're taking Yvraine, there's going to be a lot of overlap there in the amount of powers it can cast, and you might not be able to be at peak efficiency when it comes to casting powers. You might be wanting to use a regular Farseer with the Runes of Fortune instead. So I do think she's solid. I do think she's A tier just because I think it's amazing that she's a great combat psyker who can do combat very well as cast psychic powers. And I definitely use her in the Ynnari lists that I have. I really like her. I like using the Triumvirate personally, but you know, sometimes the Visarch doesn't quite make it in there. But Yvraine always makes it in there. I love the model. I love the fact that, again, she's a Farseer who can also fight in combat. I think that's really useful in a lot of situations. And I ended up putting her in A tier because of it. And last on our list is, of course, the Yncarne. So the Yncarne is an S tier, and if there was something above an S tier for the Ynnari, I would put it in there. Now, he is Ynnari specific, but for the Ynnari, he's basically an auto-include. Why is he an auto-include? Because he has one of the best redeployment abilities in the entire game, which makes kill order very important for your opponent to have to worry about. And of course, you could always trigger it yourself by killing an enemy unit and appearing where that enemy unit died. So that basically means not only can you use his redeployment ability offensively, but you can use it defensively as well if your enemy decides to kill something in the backline and maybe the Yncarne is a little bit exposed. You can just zip that unit behind some obscuring terrain and not have to worry about it. So this is especially good if you're going on the offensive with the Yncarne and can make him an extremely difficult target to deal with. Now, if that's all he had, in addition to his psychic powers, he would probably just be a middling character, probably wouldn't be that great. But he has absolutely insane damage in both the psychic, shooting, and combat phase. He can ignore invulns in close combat. His shooting is absolutely amazing because it hits everything within a radius, and auto hits, by the way. And just like the Avatar of Khaine, all damage that he receives is halved, rounding up. So he's extremely durable, especially with Strands of Fate. He knows all of the Revenant powers on top of that and can cast 2 powers a turn. So this guy can basically, in your movement phase, or in your psychic phase, I should say, pop up near an enemy unit that just died, use his psychic powers to blow up everything around him, shoot to blow up everything around him, and then he can't charge after that, but if your opponent then tries to kill another one of your units before the Yncarne, you can literally just spirit the Yncarne out of there and use the Yncarne's ability to place him where that friendly unit just died, possibly in a very safe location or a much safer location, denying things like enemy charges and stuff like that. This can be extremely frustrating for an enemy opponent and can make it extremely difficult for them to actually pin him down and kill him. And between this and the army-wide strike first that the Yncarne have, this is why the Yncarne are dominating the tournament scene much higher than the Craftworld Eldar are at the current moment because of the Yncarne. So is the Yncarne going to get nerfed? Probably. I probably see a slight nerf, although even still, the Yncarne are not super over the top in terms of competitive play. I think they're sitting at like 51%, which is pretty average, so I think we'll probably see a minor nerf to the Yncarne. But essentially, that's why Craftworld Eldar are lagging a little bit behind Yncarne, even though they pretty much have access to the same units. I know that Yncarne does have access to Dark Eldar and things like that as well. But, you know, the Yncarne is such a powerful piece that can be used in so many different ways that it is really hard to deal with for opponents. So for all of those reasons, I ended up putting the Yncarne in S tier. Absolutely God unit, literally an avatar of the Whispering God, and just a fantastic looking model as well. I mean, the model looks fantastic. I don't own it. I proxied it in the game I tried it with a couple of times, but you know, just fantastic model, fantastic rules in general, and just S tier unit overall. Alrighty, and that's going to be it for today, and that's going to end our tier list series with HQ. We're not going to do flyers because we only have 2 flyers to choose from, so I mean, that's not really much of a tier list, you know, and we only have 1 super heavy, so we're not going to go into those categories. So that's going to be it for our tier list series, and I'll see you guys later. This is going to be the end of this video. Leave a comment in the comment section if you guys have any opinions or thoughts about the current selection of units, or just have questions in general. I'm very open to answering your guys' questions or anything that you might want to know. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. See you guys next time. And later this week, we're going to be having a video coming out on how to deal with Thousand Suns. So stay tuned for that one. Have a good one, everybody.